So is Australia's news media just too prudish to cover a politician's sex scandal? Good article in the New York Times this week on February 14, and I want to read you from the article and give you some of my thoughts. So Barnaby Joyce, probably the last politician average Australians would expect to be embroiled in a sex scandal. So the New York Times has really ramped up with their Australia coverage the past couple of years. A comparison to Mike Pence isn't so far-fetched. They're both second in charge of a conservative government led by a flashy businessman and standard bearers for family values tilled in the nation's agrarian heartland. For most of the Australian public, Mr. Joyce was a bumbling farm boy who meant well. Last week, though, a story broke that turned public sentiment against him. Following investigations by two small websites last year, the Sydney-based Daily Telegraph reported that the Deputy Prime Minister was having a child with a former staff member, Vicky Campion. He's now left his wife, left his 4 kids, moved in with Vicky Campion. And the headline was Bundle of Joyce. But this story, like so many others, involves personal hypocrisy. It's hardly surprising. Mr. Joyce has been a strident opponent of gay marriage, basing his opposition in part on what he has called his 4 daughters' right to a secure relationship with a loving husband and the right of every child to know his or her mother or father. What is more noteworthy is the degree to which the Joyce affair has sparked a long overdue debate about the deference Australian media still accords politicians when it comes to their private lives. So I was talking to a mate of mine in Australia today, and he thinks that's right. He says, yes, it's right that the Australian media just leaves politicians' sex lives just out of it, unless there's just, an obvious conflict of interest. He thinks that to report on politicians' sex lives would reduce their standing and the respect they get from the public. Well, I don't want to increase politicians' standing and respect they get from the public. I want them to receive the same scrutiny that a basketball coach receives, or an ice skater, Olympian ice skater, or an actor, or major businessman. I think they all deserve scrutiny. And what people do with their sex life is revealing. That's usually going to be the person who has the most influence over them. I know when I've gotten into a hot and heavy sexual relationship, that person I'm with, I have the most intense, powerful bond with that person compared to everyone else in the world. So yeah, I think people have a right to know who their politicians are screwing. Mr. Joyce's relationship with Miss Campion, we've learned in the past few days, is an open secret among the Canberra press corps. Canberra is Australia's capital city. Back in October, Sherry Markson, the reporter who eventually got the print scoop, wrote a piece alluding to a deeply personal crisis in Mr. Joyce's life. Now that the story's out there, it's very easy to read between the lines about vicious rumors and personal pressures in dozens of media clips from last year. The Deputy Prime Minister's private situation was well known enough that he got into a pub brawl with a constituent about it last year and apparently knocked the man's hat off. Did the media choose not to report on Mr. Joyce because they didn't have all the facts? Perhaps in part. As a national broadsheet, The Australian has reported, repeated inquiries about Miss Campion's multiple job titles, let alone her taxpayer-funded salary, were met with stonewalling. Mr. Joyce would refuse to talk about the relationship when they asked. This week, he released a statement denying that the relationship and Miss Campion's employment in the government breached ministerial rules. Another major consideration is that Australian journalists face extremely strict libel laws, the kind Donald Trump would appreciate. And yet the Telegraph was not congratulated by its peers for nailing down a tough story. If anything, it was condemned, with concerns raised about hurting the feelings of Mr. Joyce's daughters, as if their feelings had not already been hurt. The tawdriness of a long lens picture of a pregnant woman, undeniable, but perhaps an unfortunate byproduct of those stringent libel laws which demand absolute proof, and the sentiment that we're no saints ourselves. It was suggested that readers should be more interested in energy policy than Mr. Joyce's affair, or that we should instead focus on inconsistencies in Mr. Joyce's stance on eliminating the government debt, because that wouldn't embarrass, hurt, and humiliate the people caught up in a marital breakdown. News reports, it seems, must never embarrass anyone. Weirdly, one editor seemed to back away from the business of journalism itself. Parliament, he wrote, is full of rumors, and to chase them all down would be a full-time job. So this seemingly strange reluctance of Australian media to report on what in most countries is by now a no-brainer is in part cultural. The media in the land of Rupert Murdoch has traditionally taken great pride in differentiating itself from the tabloid press of Britain, which it views as grubby for its obsession with politicians' sex lives. In the 1990s, a multi-year affair between the Australian Foreign Minister, that's Gareth Evans, okay, and the leader of an influential third party who eventually defected to the minister's side was kept under wraps. So the defector was Cheryl Zena Kernot, and she was a leader of the Australian Democrats, eventually moved over to the Labour Party. So back to this excellent New York Times article. Okay, it was long after the affair ended. Neither was in politics. Only when one of the parties published an aggrieved memoir complaining about her treatment by the press that a highly respected journalist made what he called the agonizing decision to air what had long been known by outsiders. And so who is that journalist? It was political journalist Laurie Oakes criticized Kernot for failing to mention an extramarital affair she had with Gareth Evans while she was the leader of the Democrats. Evans was the deputy leader of the Labour Party and a key advocate of her move to Labour. And she made no mention of this. Laurie Oakes had leaked emails in his possession that Kernot had a 5-year relationship with Gareth Evans, who was the deputy leader of the Labour Party. This time around, however, the public was much more interested than the press had decided it should be. By the weekend, the conventional wisdom was that Mr. Joyce's career was probably finished, and there have been signs that media outlets are getting the message. Since the initial story, other newspapers have changed their stance and begun reporting more aggressively on Mr. Joyce's behavior. This week, for instance, Fairfax Media reported on his alleged misconduct at the 2011 award ceremony, where he was accused of groping some woman. Could the Joyce affair finally prompt Australian journalists to decide that the affairs of politicians are questions of public interest? At issue is whether the voters have a right to know whether the candidate espousing traditional values is actually living traditional values. And if he's espousing the sanctity of marriage, is he upholding this sanctity in his own life? An election took place while the affair was going on. It's possible this wouldn't have made a difference. Mr. Joyce's margin of victory was substantial, and voters are an unpredictable lot these days. Of course, we've had all these revelations about Donald Trump's many affairs, and it's making no difference with his popularity. But to point out that it was widely known in his district anyway, as some journalists have argued with a shrug, it goes against the notion that it was too hard to find proof, as others have maintained. And what about the 2 consenting adults defense, which even Mr. Joyce's political opponents were trundled out? For starters, Mr. Joyce is a strident opponent of gay marriage. It's made it his business what other consenting adults do. We also don't know yet whether or not public money was used to facilitate the relationship. Most important, though, we're in the midst of a complicated and charged debate about workplace gender dynamics. Perhaps what journalists are really saying about why they didn't report this story is that it's not the decent thing to do. It's not in the spirit of giving someone a fair go, a posture of laid-back egalitarianism highly prized in Australian culture. Perhaps, too, it makes them uncomfortable, as it compromises working relationships they've built up over years, which have granted them access to report on important stories they believe are more firmly in the national interest. These are valid arguments to be made about the way the story was presented, but greater transparency, not less, what readers now expect from public figures and from news organizations too. Some great points. And wow, I've got Jack Jones, who's a Sydney lawyer. So Mr. Jones, what do you think about Australia's overly restrictive libel laws? If you send me an email or a Twitter, I can bring you right into this conversation. You can keep your face hidden if you like. You can turn the camera off on your cam. But it'd be fun to interview you about libel laws in Australia, how the Australian news media is so cocked, how they're so prudish about reporting on the sexual lives of politicians, and like Australians are, really racist, but the media is really politically correct. So yeah, it's a really big dichotomy. Like your average Australian, of course, is white. Country's 85% white, and the average Australian does not want fewer white people in the country. He wants a white Australia. Australians were never given the choice about the white Australia policy. It was imposed on them by their elites. The two major political parties, the Liberals and the Labor Party, have had this tacit agreement to not fight about immigration. So Australians have never had the opportunity to affect immigration policy through their votes, which is ludicrous. Like, their right to decide how many immigrants and what kind of immigrants Australia takes is completely not in their hands. This instead rests solely with the elites who respond to pressure and who want a virtue signal. So Jack Jones, let me know if you want to link to this chat. I'd love to bring you in, get your perspective from Sydney. And even if you don't want to come on to the chat now, definitely send me an email. We can stay in touch. Okay, so do you want to Skype me? So on Skype, so there's my Skype name. So if you want to Skype me, I'll bring you in via Skype. So let me know if Skype works for you. Or if you just want my phone number, I'll give you my phone number. So let me know. I can bring you in via speakerphone, and we can all benefit from your expertise on Australian politics, on Australia's legal system. And I'll just write in my phone number. So whatever is easiest for you. It'd be great to bring you in and get some expertise. Like, Australia was a white-topia, and it was self-consciously designed to be a white-topia. And from its independence around 1906, I believe it became independent. Australia self-consciously created a white-only country, so that at the time of World War II, Australia was 99% white. Yeah, there were the Aboriginals, the natives, but they have an average IQ of 55. All right, they're not terribly impressive or formidable people. My experience with Aboriginals growing up was that they were usually drunk and lying around in the streets. They just seemed like a completely different species. There was just so little connection between Aboriginals and regular Australians. So, I mean, I don't think Americans can't understand it. Like, I have Americans who ask me, well, what did you ever do for Aborigines when you're in Australia? Did you volunteer to help them out? They think that they're this poor, persecuted, oppressed people, held down by white racism and a white power structure, and that they have all these phenomenal gifts, that if the man just took his foot off the throats of these avos, that that they would start designing skyscrapers and creating modern Wakanda in Australia. But it's hard to get across to people what it's like dealing with a group with an average IQ of 55. They're basically no people that's less intelligent than Aborigines, like anywhere in the world. I mean, 55 is your average IQ. I mean, the first, Aboriginal didn't graduate medical school till the 1980s, okay? You had Maoris graduating medical school in like the 1880s, right? So I think the first full-blooded Aboriginal graduated university was like in the 1960s, or perhaps 1970s. Now you've got a lot of Aborigines, graduating medical school, graduating law school, graduating from university, but they're often, no darker than I am, like 1/16th Aboriginal, but they stress it because they get, so many affirmative action benefits. So they stress their tiny bit of white heritage. They're often blonde, and they're still, claiming that they're Aborigines. They just have a tiny little bit or some tenuous claim of being Aborigine. They're just given every possible benefit, and so we even have some like slightly Aboriginal woman who's converted to Orthodox Judaism in Australia, and she's a doctor, and she's like celebrated by the news media, and isn't diversity wonderful? And she looks nothing like an Abo. Looks nothing like an Abo. It's just a scam, just like Elizabeth Warren claiming that she's part Cherokee, and you can see it in her cheekbones. It's absolutely ridiculous. So there was a terrific 5-part series on the war on white Australia, a case study in the culture of critique, by an academic using the pen name of Brenton Sanderson. He wrote this series in 2012, and it's about the war on white Australia. So let me find it here again. It's on the Occidental Observer, which is a very important website. Great read. Check out the Occidental Observer. We got Peter Thiel moving to Los Angeles. So he's tired of Silicon Valley, a one-party state, and sounds like he might be starting a right-wing cable news network to compete with Fox News. So that could be exciting. Anyway, Brenton Sanderson writes, results from the 2011 Australian census reveal that, for the first time in that nation's history, the majority of migrants are now arriving from Asia instead of Europe. Indians and Chinese have become the fastest growing sections of the Australian population. Between 2006 and 2011, the number of Australian permanent residents born in India increased by 100%. Those born in China increased by 54%, and those born in the Philippines by 42%. These startling figures do not even include those born in Australia to Indian or Chinese parents. The census also revealed that other non-white immigrant groups were also expanding rapidly, including various African groups. And all of this is dismal news for white Australians and indeed for white people everywhere. Unfortunately, these figures only mirror what is happening throughout the West, where white people are under demographic and cultural siege from race replacing levels of third world immigration and the official embrace of multiculturalism. In just a few decades, these malignant policies have transformed Western societies to the detriment of their European-derived populations and culture. It is a remarkable fact that this revolution in immigration and social policy throughout the West occurred at around the same time, 1962 to 1973. That all these countries, these changes reflected the attitudes of elites rather than the great mass of citizens. Whoa, I'm sorry, sir. If you call me one more time, I promise to pick up. One more time, please. And by habit, I never, I don't have the ringer on my phone. So this time I promise I will see it. So you called twice and I missed it. And I apologize for that. So I like to lead a really tranquil life. I like to check my cell phone as little as possible. And so unfortunately I had the ringer off, but this next time, I promise you, I will get you. And yeah, I'm too cheap to call you back on regular phone line. Here we go. Okay, sir, it's great to talk to you. How are you, mate? Are you there, mate? I can't hear you. I don't know why I can't hear you. But I picked up. I've got you on speaker. And I can't hear you, mate. Are you there, mate? So I picked up. The call's gotten through, but I can't hear anything you're saying. So can you hear me? Trying to. Oh, call failed. Okay. Whoops. So try back one more time, mate. I'm here for you. I want to talk to you. We got an attorney in Sydney who will give us some insight into the situation in Australia, country about 85% white, but it seems to be decreasing. Every month as more and more immigrants pour in from China, from India, and from the Philippines. So call one more time, mate. Here we go. How are you, mate?
All right, not bad. Is Mr. Jones, Mr. Forty?
Yeah, speaking, mate. I've got you live on the stream, so everyone else can hear you too.
Do?
Yeah.
I'm all right, not bad, Mr. Ford.
Oh, very good to hear you. How on earth did you find me, mate?
Well, it's a small world. I probably know Mr. Dr. Frank Salter and Professor Fraser from Sydney.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, they're good friends of mine.
Oh,
and
great.
I'm very, very good friends with Mr. Tom Sunik from Croatia.
Oh, okay, very good.
It's a small world.
Yeah.
And there is if I can sort of digress before I get on the topic of current topic about Australia and the scandal here in Sydney or here in Australia, I can tell you that there is a substantial, how will I put it, conservative all-right group in Sydney of about at least about 150 young students.
Great.
And they're a very interesting bunch of people. But I do follow you. It is Monday morning here in Sydney, so it's actually 3 minutes to 1. And I do follow you on what you're saying and your videos. It is very interesting people you interview.
Yeah, well, thank you.
I love.
That's great. I was
That's great. Yes. So, what would you like to talk? You would like to talk about the current problems which the media or the Australian public is facing.
Yeah, like why is the news media in Australia so reluctant to report on the sex lives of politicians?
Well, I think it's the reason. I think is the puritanical nature and politically correct ambience of our culture. I suppose it's also true of America and Europe. As a semi-retired lawyer here in Sydney, and today's my day off. I'm actually calling you from my home office, and I'm calling under the pseudonym, as you can appreciate.
Yes.
The situation basically with Mr. Joyce was he was happily married. He's a sort of a country representative in Queensland, and he has a wife and 4 daughters. But unfortunately, he's had an affair with one of his staffers, a young lady by the name of Campion, Vicky Campion.
Yeah.
She's 33 years of age, and he's about 51, 52, I think. But I think it's the problem is with the Conservative Party, which is called the Liberal Party, Country Liberal Party. It's like a coalition. Now, he's a Deputy Prime Minister, and now he's so-called embroiled in this sex scandal, for one of the better words. But as I see it, it's just a political digression from the real issues facing Australia and the Western world.
Yeah, and the only politician,
issue.
yeah, the only politician dealing with that is Pauline Hanson, right?
Well, Pauline Hanson is, yes, certainly. There is also Corey Bernardi, which is a very interesting person, which I had the pleasure of meeting about a year ago or so. He's the new founding person of the Australian Conservative Party, which is a breakaway from the Liberal Party. He was a Liberal senator. When we say Liberal, it's comparable to the Republican.
Yes.
So please, if your listeners should not get confused, if I say Liberal, it is conservative, or it's not like your former what is it, the Democrats.
Yes.
Totally opposite. So what? Getting back on the point, I think, is that Australia is facing incredible problems. The debt, the march through the institution, which is quite recognisable, and all the positions in bureaucracy, in private sector, are consciously or subconsciously, I think that's my personal view, are neo-Marxist or neoliberal thought. So anywhere you see anything, the phobias and problems about political correctness just permeates throughout society, and it's getting more and more pressure. But what he did basically is not so much an issue with most of the average person. He is the Prime Minister, which is Mr. Malcolm Turnbull, can't second. He's a different, the Deputy Prime Minister from a different party, the National Party. And so he's the head of the National Party, but it's a coalition of Liberal and National Party. So that was the problem. But he is falling in popularity. He has taken over from Mr. Tony Abbott, who was the leader of the Liberal Party. And as I said, I think the issue is not so much Mr. Joyce or anything. He's trying to create a digression, political digression, which is the oldest trick in the book, I suppose, of talking about something totally irrelevant rather than talking about pertinent issues like the economy, like the pressure on single mothers, the crime, Sudanese crime in Melbourne that you probably heard about,
yes,
which is all covered up. And my wife, who works for a lawyer who works for legal aid, how would I put it? I don't know what the comparable thing in America would be. People who cannot afford a lawyer, you get a lawyer appointed by the government. Deals with a lot of Aborigines and the lower echelon of our society, I suppose. I'm not trying to be disparaging against the lower socioeconomic groups, but out Western Sydney and outer western suburbs of Melbourne also, you'll see huge so-called modern ghettos and social economic problems are awful. I suppose if you want to make a comparison, you can make a comparison with, I don't know, Philadelphia, Detroit,
yeah,
America, with desolate places just popping up, and crime is exponentially rising. These are the issues which either the Liberal Party, neither the Labor Party or the Greens, they're the other major parties in Australia, like to address. So, blessing, as you can probably find out, I used to be a Marxist in my student days about 40 years ago, but now I'm so right-wing
yeah,
that President Trump is too conservative for me.
yeah.
But I suppose as you get older, you get more either left or right. But if these are my personal views which I'm expressing about the political scene in Australia.
Yeah. Now, are there any major politicians in Australia willing to talk about race?
No. You mentioned Pauline Hanson.
Yeah.
Now, Pauline Hanson has about 10% had a popularity, and her popularity was rising. Currently, her popularity is actually falling. It's down to apparently about 5 or 6%. One of the reasons for this I suppose, is the rise of the conservative Cory Bernardi's Conservative Party, which has taken a lot of votes from Pauline. But the problem with Pauline, as I see, she's a one agenda party, and the agenda being is basically stop immigration, which is very popular. And then, well, Tony Abbott managed to stop that about 5 or 6 years ago, protecting Australia's borders. So he was successful in that. But other agendas she does not have. And the other second problem with Pauline, she micromanages everything. In other words, all her senators, etc., are subject to immense scrutiny by Miss Hanson, and most of them usually end up in a fight and either leave or become independent. So that's her problem. But I think if there's any future in the conservative political scene in Australia, I'm hedging my bet on the Cory Bernardi and the Australian Conservative Party, which has been instituted about 12 months ago, I think. Like in the whole Western world, I'm talking about Corbyn in England, or Great Britain, or Merkel in Germany, or Hillary in America. The societies are becoming more polarized, divisive in terms of politics, and it's the frightening thing, which I think is the speed of that left and right, us and them, and the middle ground, or so-called centrists, are losing out big time. And you all know about the history of Germany and the rise of Hitler, which I suppose was inadvertently caused by such a political vacuum caused from First World War and all that. I won't go into the history of it, but the vacuum is there, which usually the left or the right either tries to fill. Yeah. And that is, I think, just a general characteristic of not only Australia, but also, I think, the whole Western, white, European world, New Zealand, Australia, Canada, America, Europe.
So who would be Australia's leading white nationalist?
White nationalist is, unfortunately, we haven't got Mr. Richard Spencer or Mr. Or similar people in Australia, but as I said, we do have, I suppose, Hanson would be the person who would be considered white nationalist. We do have sort of radical on a radical fringe, but I would not class them as white nationalists in the sense of Mr. Spencer or Mr. Enoch, or who else do you have in America? The alt-right, I suppose. But again, it is growing. I think that there is a substantial force, and I do have contacts personally, as I mentioned earlier, with a growing millennial generation who are all at university studying. 3 or 4 medical doctors in there, actually. It's about half a dozen lawyers and engineers. And the last occasion we met was Mr. Trump. Mr. Trump became president, Trump went on Sydney Harbour, and we hired a huge yacht, and we had all this built the wall and congratulations Mr. Trump, and we had a bit of a barbecue and a cruise around Sydney Harbour, which was quite fun. But to answer your question, white nationalism, as you probably are aware, and what the only politician in the mainstream made was Mr. Trump. He raised the issue of immigration, of build the wall, of influx of illegal immigrants. And we had a similar problems, as you are aware, under Julia Gillard.
Yeah.
Julia Gillard, we also had open borders, and there were boats coming from Indonesia. About 3,000 people actually drowned as a consequence of that policy. And that was when a Liberal Party got into power 4 or 5 years ago under Mr. Tony Abbott. He managed to stop the boat. That was one of his platforms. He did not openly say it probably is not politically expedient to talk in terms of white nationalism, because that conjures up, unfortunately, all sorts of images in people's minds. If you say, I'm a white nationalist, you're bound to be accused of being a fascist, a Nazi, a reactionary, whatever. But that's quite normal. I think those words are losing their meaning exponentially, I think, becoming overused and they reach such a stage there's no meaning of labelling people. But in America, I've sort of noticed your trend is to call someone a Nazi. You're a Nazi, which is funny in itself. I mean, 75 years after the war, I know there are fringe groups, especially down in deep south in America, maybe 1,000, if that, who've got that Nazi regalia, but I wouldn't even call them a fringe group. I would call them nutters.
Yeah.
And they don't even hit the radar. But the media every now and then likes to conjure up Mr. David Duke and say, right, you are a face of the Nazis, because the opposition, the left, always has to have someone to point to and say, he is the culprit, he is the leader, he is the Führer. I suppose our Führer is Miss Hanson at this stage, because of her policy of her current policy, or the only policy, I suppose, of saying no immigration. Not only that, but stop immigration. Now, that is the overall picture, but Mr. Turnbull, he's actually now in America. He flew yesterday from Australia. He went to see Mr. Trump, as I understand. He will not win the election. The other option will be the Labor Party, and I do not have very much hope for Australia. Australia managed to survive the 2008 financial crisis because of our exports of minerals and various things to Asia. Australia, like America, is in millions, if not billions, if not trillions in debt. And it's kicking the can down the road, so to speak, and leaving a huge debt for my kids or my grandkids to figure out, I suppose.
Who do you think will be who do you think will be the new leader of the Liberal Party if Malcolm's defeated?
Well, I can speak personally. As I said, my the close group of friends, they are conservative. I mean, these are my personal friends. Most of them are lawyers, barristers, and solicitors. We will obviously not vote for the so-called Democrats, which is Labor or Greens. But again, we will not vote for the Liberal or Country Party. The unfortunate thing, as I see, and this is what I mentioned or I alluded to earlier, is that all the parties in the Western world have joined. There's no difference. If you ask yourself before Trump, or say, let's use America as an example, the neocons of Republican Party. What was the difference they had with the Democrats? Very, very little. They were all pro-abortion, pro-gay, trying to go, the Second Amendment about the guns and all that. Well, similar thing is happening to America. The goalposts have shifted so much to the left that it's not funny. I mean, look at the Democratic Party. I mean, Bernie Sanders is left. 10 years ago, what he's espoused and stands for he would not even dare say that. But yet he's openly flaunting his socialism, or how he calls it, democratic socialism. So we have the same situation here. The Labor Party and the Greens are espousing radical socialism. They call it the guise of democratic socialism, which is big government, big bureaucracy, and not much option. I mean, for Australia, Australia's in a precarious sort of a situation as I see it. It's in Asia geographically, and Trump is going very conservative, breaking all the treaties. They make America great again. They're using the slogans of 1930s, Lindbergh and Roosevelt, I think, which I think is great. But now Brexit is a very, very, very important issue, and Australia's trying to, I think, in my humble view, trying to make connections with Britain and various other Asian countries in terms of trade and politics and connections. It's interesting that you mentioned that Mr. Trump has decreased his tax down to 21%. Well, Mr. Turnbull's trying to do literally the same, to decrease company tax down to 25%. Unfortunately, he has not got the majority in the Senate, and I don't think that will pass. But one of the reasons he's gone to America and talked to Mr. Trump is to probably ask Trump and America for some sort of assistance, how he's going to fit in the global order, or more particularly disorder, which is now occurring all over the world. The eye which I'm having on is Europe. I think that is the sleeping tiger. Merkel is, as you are probably aware, is having difficulty causing or create coalition.
Yeah.
And that will permeate or continue to continue in things like Austria, Italy, and other countries. Which will experience.
Yeah, let's get back to Australia. Let's get back to Australia. What about, isn't there a growing anti-Muslim movement in Australia?
Oh, there is, absolutely. I mean, but again, if you do come to Australia and you have a look at it, and you read our mainstream media, you will find that it's not reported. As I said, my wife is a lawyer and works for the government for the disadvantaged people, encounters that daily. They're totally disproportionately represented in jails. But no one talks about that. I mean, it's politically not correct and not expedient to advertise those facts, not propaganda facts. So it's all on hush-hush under the table. And obviously, that is the problem. It's soft authoritarianism or this neo-Marxist dystopian world which we are living in, I suppose.
So maybe it'll take a major terrorist attack to kind of wake up Australians and kind of develop a reactionary party that will reactionary movement that will take on the Muslim menace.
Well, it is, but the problem is obviously the fourth estate, which is the media, controls anything, and they're always trying to associate terrorism with either some Looney Tune who'd done that individually, and not trying to call a state, so to speak. It is interesting. We had a terrorist attacker 2 or 3 years ago in Barton Place here in Sydney. He shot a bartender and and a female barrister. He killed them, and all of a sudden the media reported and attributed everything to his mental condition rather than his vocal connection to various mosques here in Australia. That is similarly happening in America, I think. They're always trying to sweep it under the carpet, not talk about the pertinent issue, because the truth sometimes hurts, and it doesn't fall into a narrative, acceptable political narrative.
And and what about Australia's hate speech laws? I mean, they restrict.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
Yeah, what about Australia's hate speech laws? You know, hate speech laws restrict what you can say in Australia. You can get.
Well, there is that as well. That's very interesting. There is it's called 18C. That's hate speech.
Yeah.
Now, it's a human rights commission. I think it's comparable to Canadian law. Canada has similar laws because it is a Commonwealth country. Fortunately for Americans, you've got your First and Second Amendment, and it's entrenched in your Constitution, the freedom of speech, which is again being under incredible attack. I do watch and try to keep up with current affairs and politics, world politics. But 18C, basically, if you say something out of place, derogatory on the old verbiage of race or sex or religion, you may, or write something derogatory, you are liable to be marched in front of a multicultural commission, and one of the commissioners is Mr. Parmesan, a young lawyer from Indonesia, of all places. So he's half Chinese and Indonesian, I think. It is sort of as I see it, I, as a lawyer, for example, when I can't say anything, and my anonymity must be respected. And you watch your words, and you look around before you say and talk, which is unfortunate. We have come, and there's no protection in the Australian Constitution, either state or federal constitution, like you have in America, where you entrenched in a constitution that you have a right to say what you want, provided you don't cause or you don't aspire to violence or foreseeable detriment. For example, calling fire in a theatre or something stupid like that. So I think, and we've both got common law because of the common British or English heritage, but unfortunately Australia does not have those freedom or right of association and right of freedom of speech entrenched in its constitution, which is unfortunate. But now there's a big drive, as you probably heard, of changing the constitution, not entrenching or introducing freedom of speech similar to American model, but rather recognising Aborigines.
Yeah.
So here we are. We are talking, giving recognition to Aborigines. Now, there's a big historical history, culture wars raging. Most Indigenous Aborigines, some of them are blue-eyed and blonde, and you would not pick them as being Aborigines, but anyway, they are claiming to be Aborigines, and they are given that status in law, and literally Currently out of 24 million population of Australia, 24, 25 million, about 600,000 claim to be Aborigines. And obviously they are looking for compensation. It's the victim card which is blatantly played.
Yeah.
The attack on the Catholic Church, we just had a Royal Commission, was just, it's been going on for 2 or 3 years, or 12 months or whatever. The final determination or recommendation to the government is that there has been a systemic abuse which has throughout the Catholic Church, not only in Australia but all over the world.
Yeah.
And now the church is subject to compensation, which is being formulated as we speak. There's going to be few millions, if not billions, of dollars being given. It's this victim mentality, us and them, which is prominent and boiling under the surface.
Yeah. The
mainstream media, the television, we all get American news, Fox News, CNN, the numbing news. I call CNN and Clinton no news, but anyway, that's my take on CNN.
Yeah. Okay, mate. I gotta run off.
It is a bleak picture, but that's unfortunately. If you would like to find out anything, you're more than welcome.
Okay, mate. Let's stay in touch. I gotta run off now, but it's good to.
Thank you very much, and pleasure of talking to you.
Okay.
And get Tom on, and I'll watch it.
Okay.
He was my guest actually.
Okay.
And I saw you when he was in America.
Okay.
I saw that video about 3 or 4 years ago.
Okay,
he
great.
was your guest.
Okay. Thanks, mate. Cheers.
All the best.
Cheers, mate.
Nice talking to you.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Cheers now. Bye-bye. Okay, a report from an attorney in Sydney, Australia. The hate speech laws, the lack of anyone speaking out for white interests, the inability to speak honestly about race in the public forums, and a lot of bad news from Australia. So for now, bye-bye.